We could go on and on about the women who were accused of witchcraft. One of the craziest being Sweden of 1667, when a boy entered a physical altercation with a female who kicked his butt. So he accused her of casting spells and walking on water. And then the priest of the town was like, hey, a witch must have infiltrated our community. She blamed a woman named Marette for teaching her magic, and claimed that they flew on a cow together to go visit the devil. Damn. Honestly, why did this all happen? Typically, it's a woman who's called a witch, and it came out of them not conforming to society in one way or another. So this was utilized as a way to control women. There's patterns throughout history of popularization of witchcraft and feminism. Native American rights activist Matilda Jocelyn Gage wrote about witches in her 1893 book, Women, Church, and State, basically stating that many women who were accused of being witches were brilliant minds of their age and a threat to the patriarchy. If you guys want to know some of the theories behind the Salem witch trials, go to my Instagram. Two of the most terrifying dolls to ever exist come down to Robert the doll and Annabelle. And first, we'll just start with Robert. And I'm going to be as respectful as possible when talking about this because apparently if you're not, you could die. That's why Robert's casing is filled with apology notes from people who have had severe bad luck after disrespecting him upon seeing him at the museum. So let's get into Robert's backstory. As you guys know, the movie Chucky, who was based on this homicidal doll, was inspired by the doll Robert. Well, there was this family, the Otto family, and back in the early 1900s, they had a 10-year-old son named Eugene, who was given a doll that was gifted by one of the family servants. Well, this doll is honestly just very creepy. He is 3 feet in length and dressed up in a sailor's costume, and while this is terrifying now, back in the early 1900s, he was just a normal doll. Well, upon receiving the gift of Robert, Eugene got extremely attached to him. He'd bathe him, eat with him, and even sleep with him. I'm debating on seeing if this doll that I have is haunted. I'm a little scared to ask it questions, but maybe we'll try. But first, let's finish Robert's story. So Eugene continued to get more and more attached to this doll. And while this was normal at the age of 10, by the age of 13, it was a little much. His family would walk by his room and hear him talking to Robert. And they would hear Robert respond, but at first they thought Eugene had just made up a voice for him. But one day, the mom looked in to hear Robert's voice, which was very deep, and did not see her son's mouth moving. So the father got terrified and was like, hey, you need to stop sleeping with this doll. And trying to convince them, he was like, he might get dirty. But he was just trying to create that separation. And when this happened, they walked back into his room in the middle of the night because they heard screaming and crying. And they walked in to see furniture thrown and his toys mutilated. As time went on, scratches occurred on the wall, things were broken. And Eugene would always blame Robert for these things. The parents were very worried about his attachment to Robert and also the fact that he was blaming Robert for all his mistakes. Things get worse. Well, Eugene's dad comes up with an amazing idea of what to do with this terrifying doll. He takes him away and places him in the attic where no one can see him. But Robert decides to throw parties up there. He would make noises, and when guests would come over, they would hear screaming at night. Neighbors would even claim that they would see Robert move from the attic window. So he was essentially just terrorizing this family. So why exactly was this happening? Apparently, the mom did not treat her servants very well and even walked in on one of them doing black magic. I mean, who knows if this was true, but apparently she saw this and fired her. And as a parting gift, she ended up giving Robert to their son. Potentially doing voodoo on him? I don't know. But these happenings apparently decreased this family's social status by a lot, which was everything back then. Well, Eugene grew up, moved out of the house, and got married. And the family just kept the house and continued to keep Robert up there. Once Eugene's father passed away, he ended up inheriting the house. So Eugene's family moved back into the house around the 1920s. And Eugene found Robert again. So after years of not being attached to Robert, Eugene starts this cycle again. He finds the doll, brings it down to his wife, and is like, hey, here's this doll. And let me tell you, she is terrified of it. She's creeped out. She's like, no. But Eugene essentially introduces Robert as the new member of the family. He brings the doll to work with him. He was a painter, so he would set him up and have him just watch his murals. He took him to dinner and would feed the doll again. And his wife sometimes would hear the giggle of a child and walk by the room to see Robert in there. And then one night Eugene asked if Robert could sleep in their bed, and his wife was like, absolutely not. So he just put him on a chair next to them, and she was getting horrible night terrors. And not only this, but his mood changed just like it did when he was a kid. Instead of tantrums, he would have mood swings and become completely abusive to his wife. But during this time, divorce was considered failure. So they just remained together. And he passed away in 1974. So Robert finds a new child to attach to. Well, during the 70s and 80s, there was this rise of being scared of cults and Satanism. And so when this 10-year-old girl moved in and got extremely obsessed with the doll, such as bathing and eating and sleeping with it, And then the parents would start to hear the deep voice respond to her. They were worried that it was something satanic. So they took Robert straight to the priest, but he ended up bringing them back, and they tried to do the attic thing again. Eventually, it was just given to the East Martello Museum in Key West, Florida, where he now resides in a little glass box. But there's so many offerings and apology letters to him because of people disrespecting him and him causing apparently bad luck. And so many workers have reported seeing him move. Either way, Robert, I am so sorry for talking about you. Come over to my YouTube if you guys want to see me find out if my doll is haunted, and also talk to you guys about the Annabelle story. I'm going to be asking her some questions and sharing the original story of Annabelle. Witches have always had a dark history surrounding them. Both witch hunting and witch trials is responsible for the death of tens of thousands of women, and goes way beyond the typical story that we know of the Salem witch trials. And something as simple as you challenging someone else's beliefs would cause you to get accused. And the only way to get out of being accused is to blame other people, which is why this hysteria got so out of hand. So why did this happen, and what were they so afraid of? Well, let's start with Matthew Hopkins back in March of 1644. He became one of the most notorious witch hunters and was responsible for 300 witches being tried and executed. Allegedly, he had encountered 6 witches in Manning where they tried to kill him, and then realized that he could make the equivalent of a month's rent off of capturing them. So this man was just throwing out accusations everywhere. And how did he find out if they were a witch? Well, he would bind them and dunk them into water, and if they floated, that means the water was repelling them and they denied baptism. But he was just the start of what became known as the Newcastle Trials. An entire purge took place in Newcastle out of fear of witches. In 1650, a Scottish man known as the Bellman was hired by Puritans. He had claimed that he could identify a witch just by looking at her. And he himself was solely responsible for the death of 120 women. And he was making bank off of doing this. But karma eventually got to him, and he also died through execution. So what exactly did they think witches were? While they all shared a similar fear, different parts of the world didn't have the same concept for witchcraft. The Western world saw it as just ordinary people utilizing the supernatural to create magic, while many other parts of the world saw witches as someone who inherently possessed supernatural powers. But most people just associated it with the devil. And these women endured so much torture that they would just confess to it at the end. The title of this book is translated to The Hammer of Witches, and it included information on how to identify and legally prosecute a witch. And it talked about things like shape-shifting and doing the nasty with the devil. Pope Gregory quoted saying that demons aided all magic. While this isn't true, everyone believed it. So King James one time was nearly killed by a storm at sea, and he believed it was an assassination attempt through witchcraft. So a new trial started with 70 suspected women. One woman named Gayla Duncan ended up turning in her employer, who was able to heal others in a way that was naturally miraculous. And she ended up naming other people, which set off the North Berwick witch trials, which led to the capturing and torturing of Agnes Sampson. And through these many tactics and sleep deprivation, she ended up admitting to being involved in the conspiracy to kill King James. Another woman by the name of Alice Kettler had been married 4 times and had several stepchildren, and these stepchildren ended up accusing her of killing all of her ex-husbands. She became the first woman in Ireland to even be accused of witchcraft. Then we have Catherine, who in 17th century France had a mostly female clientele, her most notable client being the mistress of Louis XIV. And she was blamed for the affair through making a potion, because of course, why would it be the king's fault? So she was burned at the stake in February of 1680. So what types of women were accused of being witches? These traits included being an older woman without a family, not being married, missing church, suspected of immoral behaviors, or just being flat out too smart. In 1656, one woman was being hung by evidence by she had more wit than her neighbors. And many of the men who were suspected were just not straight. And why did they choose the process of burning a witch? Well,